Abuse is a really strong word, and for those of us that have been abuse victims, chances are our abuser had a lot invested in convincing us that what we were experiencing was not abuse. And this can leave a lot of us very confused. So in this video, I want to define exactly what abuse is, in my view, in my opinion, and help anybody out there that might be confused figure out whether or not what they've experienced is actually something that they can call abuse. Welcome to Looking Behind the Mirror, where we explore narcissism and take our lives back as we make sense out of nonsense. As a quick disclaimer, everything I say is based on my opinions and my personal experiences. I'm not a professional, and if you're really struggling, I encourage you to seek professional help. I am providing links below for you. For anybody that's new to my channel and you're wondering why a channel about narcissism is talking specifically about abuse, in my view, narcissism and abuse go hand in hand. And in my opinion, I don't think that there are a lot of people out there that are habitual abusers that are not narcissists. So with that out of the way, I first just want to share with you my own definition of what abuse is. Abuse is the exploitation of a vulnerable person which harms that person and benefits the abuser. I really think this definition fits just about any type of abuse. And of course, the most obvious kind of abuse that pops in any of our heads when we think of abuse is physical abuse. And when we think of physical abuse, what do we think of? We usually think of a man abusing a woman, or an adult abusing a child, or maybe even an elderly person. And in these situations, we're imagining this because the abuse victim is usually somebody who is physically vulnerable to the abuser. A child can't usually defend themselves physically against an adult, so the child is physically vulnerable to the adult, and the adult is exploiting that vulnerability. Now, I said that the abuser is benefiting from the exploitation, and the benefits that abusers get out of abuse can be all kinds of different things, but I really think that 9 times out of 10, the benefit that the abuser gets is the way the abuse makes them feel. It's a way to regulate their emotions. It's a way to help them feel like they're powerful, like they're relevant, like they're in control. Maybe it's just a way for them to let off some steam, or maybe they're just sadistic and they like being able to hurt someone. This idea of vulnerability is also one reason that a lot of society is really hesitant to call it or consider it abuse when a woman is physically abusing a man, because society doesn't view the man as vulnerable to the woman, so it's hard for society to view that as abuse. But of course, they're not considering different types of vulnerability, which is what we can now get into with different types of abuse that aren't quite so obvious to as many people. A man can be very vulnerable to a woman in lots of ways that aren't necessarily physical. Maybe he's just afraid that if he tries to defend himself that he'll be accused of physical abuse. Or maybe he's got kids with her and he's afraid of what will happen if he stands up for himself. Or maybe he's just hopelessly in love with this person and he can't bear the thought of fighting back and, quote, ruining the relationship. It's easy for us as a society to view child abuse and elderly abuse as particularly heinous because we recognize how vulnerable children and the elderly can be. But I think it's really important for us to recognize other forms of vulnerability. Vulnerabilities that can be exploited in an abusive way can include financial vulnerability. Maybe you're financially dependent on an abusive person. Maybe you're just very lonely and you think you found the last person on earth that's going to be able to spend time with you. Maybe you happen to be a very gullible person, and being gullible is not a crime. We all have to learn at some point in our lives who we can and cannot trust. People that are gullible might need to learn how to stop being so gullible, but that in no way means that they deserve any of the awful things that might happen to them because of their gullibility. And some people just don't have the self-esteem to break away from an abusive person. They feel way too reliant and dependent on the judgment of the abuser. Just to get through life, they are conditioned to feel like they can't do it on their own. In any abusive relationship, the abuser usually has some kind of power over the victim. The abuser has the victim in some kind of corner or in some kind of box. Of course, there are extreme examples where the abuser literally has the victim physically restrained or held captive somewhere, but more commonly, the abuser has the victim in an emotional type of box. Maybe somebody is in a horrible job where their boss is very abusive, but they are dependent on the job. They need the money. They can't afford to quit. Or they have been convinced by their boss that they'll never be able to find another job to replace that one. There are plenty of other emotional boxes we can find ourselves stuck in. We might even be in some kind of cult where leaving just isn't that simple, where we wake up one day and realize that we're stuck in a box and getting out is much more difficult and is going to cost us much more than we ever considered. Usually, whatever power this is that the abuser has over the victim, whatever the upper hand is that the abuser has, is directly related to the vulnerability that is being exploited in the victim. I want to use a few examples of what I consider abuse. And one, I just referred to a cult. I don't think there are a lot of cults out there that are a lot more famous than the People's Temple or the Jonestown cult that Jim Jones led in the late 70s. The People's Temple started out as a really great religious organization. Jim Jones was very welcoming, very charming, and really made a lot of very vulnerable people feel very welcome. The members of the People's Temple were very vulnerable. Many of them were marginalized. Many of them were minorities. Many of them felt like they really didn't fit into society and that there was just something missing in their lives. And Jim Jones exploited that vulnerability in his followers, and he even convinced them to follow him to Guyana to build a utopia, and unfortunately many of us know how that sadly ended for all of them. Jim Jones exploited the vulnerability in these people so that he could benefit with power, money, and control. I also want to bring up another example. If any of you have ever seen the movie The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, based on Stephen King's book, I've seen that movie probably 20 times. It's one of my favorite movies. And when I was younger, and spoiler alerts here if you've never seen it, Halloween season's coming up soon, so I highly recommend that you watch it if you haven't seen it yet. But if you haven't seen it, you probably know what happens in it anyway. When I was younger watching that movie, I never recognized Jack, the main character, as being abusive towards Wendy until I got older and I learned more about abuse and narcissism and watched the movie with new eyes and realized he's obviously an emotionally abusive person. There was a time where I, as an adult, watched The Shining and didn't see anything wrong with the relationship between Jack and Wendy until Jack is chasing them around the hotel with an axe. And that's a big part of why I have this channel, because I think that education is so important, that we know what abuse looks like and we know how we deserve to be treated. And if you watch the movie The Shining, pay attention to how Jack treats Wendy before he completely loses his mind. He's emotionally abusive and dismissive from the very beginning. And he's exploiting Wendy's good nature and Wendy's emotional dependence on him. And he benefits by having a wife that really dotes on him, is practically a servant to him. She actually ends up doing his job for him in the hotel. And of course, he has a lot of control and I'm sure a feeling of relevance in the way that Wendy allows him to treat her. So back to a more subtle example of what I consider abuse, emotional abuse. This isn't always so obvious, but a lot of the time, emotional abuse can simply just be picking at the low self-esteem of an abuse victim. And I think a lot of people that have low self-esteem don't even realize that they have low self-esteem. If you've always had low self-esteem, then you don't know what it feels like not to have low self-esteem. And how are you supposed to know that you're feeling anything out of the ordinary if you don't know what it feels like to have normal, healthy self-esteem, right? An abuser picks up on this vulnerability and exploits low self-esteem by figuring out exactly what the insecurities are and holding those things over their head. Like, if you have low self-esteem and maybe you think that you're just a really lazy person, well, an abuser might pick up on this insecurity and might actually tell you, wow, you're such a hard worker. They're taking advantage of your vulnerability by telling you exactly the opposite of what you're insecure about, of what you have low self-esteem about. So when you hear somebody say, wow, you're such a hard worker, that insecurity, that low self-esteem suddenly is filled up, and it makes you feel better about yourself, and you become really emotionally dependent on that person because of your vulnerability. And so that person now has the power to, whenever they want to take control or manipulate you, find a way to point out how lazy you are in any way they can. Like, wow, you really cut corners on that, because they know that that's your vulnerability. If you were a confident person that knew that, yeah, maybe you're not perfect, maybe you don't always run yourself into the ground, but you're not lazy, you wouldn't be vulnerable to this type of abuse. And the abuser wouldn't be able to abuse you in this way. This would just be one less tool that an abuser would have against you. If the abuser told you, wow, you're a really hard worker, you would think, oh, that's nice, thanks. And then if later that person tried to take it back by saying, wow, you really cut corners on that over there, it wouldn't hit you the same way. You wouldn't be chasing after that original compliment to make yourself feel better, to soothe your low self-esteem. You wouldn't be vulnerable in that way. Now, there are all kinds of vulnerabilities, but I also want to make it clear that not all vulnerabilities are bad. Vulnerabilities can be really good. It can be really good to share our vulnerabilities. And just loving and caring about somebody makes us vulnerable. And that's exactly the kind of vulnerability that a narcissist will avoid, like the plague. A narcissist will not allow themselves to be vulnerable by caring or loving another human being. But this is how we learn how to connect. This is how we build a healthy relationship, is through vulnerability. And by being vulnerable to the people that are close to us, we have to take a little bit of a risk that that person's not going to choose to exploit that vulnerability. But if we never give anyone a chance, then we won't be able to grow these close connections with people and build trust and build healthy relationships. So narcissists really hijack this human method of connection. This is a really beautiful, natural way that humans learn to trust, connect, and build community. And narcissists kind of get in there and take advantage of it and hurt people in order to benefit themselves. And that exploitation of those vulnerabilities is abuse. Abuse is control of a vulnerable person. And this control can very often include control of the abuse victim's mind, which is why abuse can be so hard to see, which is why so many abuse victims don't even realize that they are abuse victims. And even when they start to wonder about it, there's so many other voices in their head, there's so much conditioning in their head fighting against that idea and telling them that they're being a drama queen, that they're overreacting, that they're making a mountain out of a molehill. That's not abuse. If you are hurting and you're confused and you're wondering, is this abuse? It probably is. Most people don't wonder if they're being abused when they're in a healthy, non-abusive relationship. Now, I know that once you recognize that you are being abused, it's not always so simple to just leave the relationship. Sometimes leaving or escaping can be really, really difficult. It might even be the hardest thing you've ever had to do in your entire life. But I will tell you that the hardest hurdle to clear is the one in your own head. Once you realize that you are being abused, you've overcome the biggest obstacle to escaping. And I know that doesn't mean that the rest is going to be easy, but the rest is going to be doable. And I really hope that any of you out there that are struggling in an abusive relationship are able to find your way out soon and safely. I hope this helps. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and comment below any ideas you have for me for future videos. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you like this video and would like to see more like it in the future. Until next time, thanks. Bye.